SteamOS was first released back in 2012, and here in 2022, they might finally be onto something.
Our gamer rises from a fitful night's sleep, his hand eagerly reaching for his trusty Viper V570 gaming mouse to begin the day's hunt. Frags come easy thanks to the 12,000 DPI Avago laser sensor, allowing the gamer to score headshot after headshot on their hapless prey. With 13 programmable keys, along with addressable RGB, any gamer can customize the look and feel of the V570 to fit their needs. Strike fear into your next meal with a full lineup of gear from Viper Gaming by following the link down in the video description.
Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff. Since its release back in 2012, I've been enamored with the idea of SteamOS, a Linux-based operating system from Valve designed to bring console-like ease of use over to PC gaming. For the first 7 years, it relied entirely on developers releasing games for Linux, which, as you can imagine, saw little to no buy-in. While playing Windows-based games on Linux has been possible for decades with the help of Wine, compatibility has been fairly low, with most games just being flat-out unplayable. That is until late 2018, when Valve released Proton, a collection of compatibility features that would allow Wine to run almost any native Windows binary, along with support for APIs like DirectX. The basic idea was, instead of trying to get developers to make native Linux versions of their games, why not just make a version of Linux that is able to translate nearly any Windows dependency for the games instead? Early results were promising, but not entirely perfect. In my last video covering SteamOS, only around 57% of games in the Steam catalog were reported as being playable. Nearly any game requiring a third-party launcher or needing an always-on anti-cheat application were immediately disqualified. In July 2021, Valve made an earth-shattering announcement, but probably not the one you're thinking of. Sure, Valve's first mobile gaming handheld in the Steam Deck is a pretty big deal. A device priced to compete with the Nintendo Switch, and at less than half the price of boutique PC handhelds. It definitely has the potential to be a commercial success. Arguably, the bigger news to come out of this announcement was the software running on the Steam Deck itself, with SteamOS 3.0. Where previous releases relied on the Debian kernel, SteamOS 3.0 would be built on top of Arch. This comes with the main benefit of a faster update process for client PCs, as Debian tends to take things a little slower to ensure stability of all packages inside their repository. While the Steam Deck is an awesome handheld gaming PC, that's not the focus of today's review. I'm much more interested in SteamOS and the potential impact when it comes to fully fledged gaming PCs. In 2019, I recommended you give Steam on Linux a try if you were all interested in potentially switching to Linux. Here in 2022, I'm saying it might be time to format your Windows installs. Today's PC is a special one, as I'm installing SteamOS onto Heavy Metal, my 3/8" steel ITX PC with a custom copper-piped water loop hanging out the side. Under all that metal is an Asus ROG Strix Z690i motherboard powered by an Intel i9-12900K, 32GB of Corsair 4800MHz DDR5 memory, and an AMD RX 6900 XT. In April, Valve made the Steam Deck recovery image available for download, and it was loaded with hardware tie-ins which made it nearly impossible to install on any other system. That was until the Hollow ISO team got a hold of it. Hollow ISO is a project on GitHub which takes the official SteamOS 3.0 recovery image, removes specific hardware requirements relating to the custom AMD APU used by the Steam Deck, and adds in universal driver packages to allow booting with more generic hardware. While this isn't an official release, as they say, it is 99% of the way there, as this image is nothing more than some publicly available packages placed into the official recovery image for SteamOS. That said, there are still some limitations you need to be aware of. NVIDIA GPUs are not supported at this time, so you will need either an Intel or AMD GPU to get graphics acceleration working. Intel GPUs also require some additional steps after the installation. But if you have a 4GB USB flash drive, a modern Intel or AMD processor with a UEFI-enabled motherboard, and a desire to run Linux as your main operating system, I think we can get started. Download the Hollow ISO image and flash it onto a USB key using Balana Etcher if you're on Windows, or DD if you're in Linux. Then simply plug this into a PC of your choosing and boot it up. The installer does require an internet connection, so you'll need to make sure you're either connected via Ethernet or set up a Wi-Fi connection inside the installer. There are only a couple steps to getting SteamOS installed on your PC. Just tell the installer which drive you want to install onto, give your PC both a root and user password, and then just wait for the installer to work its magic. Once completed, just remove the USB drive and reboot your PC. Since this is just a SteamOS recovery image, you're going to be dropped directly into the out-of-box experience as if you were setting up a new Steam Deck. A little sign-in here, a touch of Wi-Fi there, and you'll be ready to get started.
Hi there. I'm Cortana, and I'm here to help.
At its core, SteamOS has obviously been tailored for use with a controller, but a keyboard and mouse will still work just fine. One major change from previous versions is this isn't just using Steam Big Picture mode. It is a completely new interface made entirely for SteamOS 3.0. Front and center on the default screen, your games. Not current promotions, not ads sold to the highest bidder, just the games you want to play and the applications you want to run. What an odd concept in today's operating system as a service era. Okay, so that's not entirely true. At the time of filming, there is a promotion to play Aperture Desk Job, a game from Valve designed just for the Steam Deck. Other than that, it's just community updates for games you have in your library, in case you're looking to connect with any other players or read the latest news for your favorite games. Any game that you have in your Steam library can be installed, whether it's native to Linux or Windows. Remember at the beginning of the video, I mentioned Valve's Proton project? It is fully integrated with SteamOS, offering support for Windows binaries and APIs to run inside of Linux. Direct games are translated into Vulkan, while OpenGL and Vulkan-based games need no translation at all. There are some features of SteamOS not working through the Holo ISO installer though, as they rely on hardware tie-ins with the Steam Deck APU. Things like power limiting and hotkeys for the SteamOS menu overlay, but pretty much every other major function works just as you would expect. Of course, if you've watched reviews for the Steam Deck, you've likely seen all of this before. The interface is completely unchanged from the mobile version. What I'm really interested in is the desktop mode. See, this is where things get really interesting. While the Steam Deck does allow you to use the desktop, by default you will boot into the Decksperience every time the device is turned on. And that makes sense, given we're talking about a mobile gaming console. Its expected use case is in line with the Nintendo Switch. Turn it on, pick a game, and get to it. Running SteamOS on a desktop though, you might have some other tasks in mind. Out of the box, SteamOS 3.0 is running Plasma KDE desktop environment, which will actually look somewhat familiar to Windows users. There's a taskbar at the bottom of the screen, an applications menu in the bottom left, and pinned common applications next to that. Over on the right, apps and services you have running in the background, along with quick access to network and audio device settings, and a clock just for good measure. Through Holo ISO, whichever mode you used last, Deck or Desktop, will be the interface your PC boots up into. For those wanting a set-top experience and a controller-centric UI, Deck certainly makes the most sense. For those who are wanting a fully featured desktop driven with a keyboard and mouse, Desktop is likely the way you'll want to go. If you've ever used Steam on a desktop, you will likely be right at home with the Steam Desktop client inside of SteamOS. The interface is quite literally identical to any client you've used inside of Windows, macOS, or Linux. Browse the store, purchase games, install and play them. Use the workshop to install mods. Every feature you've grown accustomed to is likely here. What about games or applications you purchased outside of Steam? Myself, I've got a pretty large library on Good Old Games. Can I install games from there? There's really only one additional step to installing a Windows application in SteamOS versus installing it in Windows, and that's adding it to the Steam launcher. EXEs will not launch just by double-clicking them. You still need to use Wine and Proton, and at the moment, that can only be done from the Steam desktop client. Inside of Steam, go to the Games menu and click on Add a non-Steam game. Here you can add any Windows executable and configure it to run. You can install Good Old Games Galaxy, the Epic Store Launcher, Origin, or simply launch a game installer like an offline installer from GOG.com. Select the installer's exe and click on Add Selected Games. Next, right-click on the application you just added, go to the Proton menu, and enable Proton support. I found the most success using the latest version of Proton, which at the time of filming is 7.04, instead of the experimental version. Once that's selected, just close out of the window and launch the installer from inside Steam. The installer will run just like it does inside Windows. You'll likely need to take note of the directory the game is installed into, as we need to browse to that folder once the installer is done. When you're finished, right-click on the application again, but this time go down to Browse and select the game's executable. Games installed with Proton are stored in this directory. You'll just need to select the correct executable, and then launch your game. In my testing, I've installed 32 games from both Steam and Good Old Games offline installs, and the experience has been fantastic so far. In-game, there has been little to no difference between running them on Linux and running inside of Windows. Of those 32 games, 30 of them were 100% playable, and only a couple needed some additional steps outside of what you would normally expect in a Windows environment. My games list includes titles both new and old, and some games are even older than that, in order to give the broadest scope possible as far as playability. I have games stretching as far back as 25 years, because I still enjoy playing those games even on modern hardware, and 25-year-old games are still part of the PC ecosystem. With that, let's go over some of the more notable games, and I guess we can start with one of the ones that didn't work, and that's Just Cause 2. While the game seemed to install just fine, upon launching, all I get is a black screen and no other options appear visible. However, I have seen reported that this game does in fact work, so this may have just had something to do with my particular setup. Remember, SteamOS on hardware other than the Steam Deck should be seen as highly experimental and unsupported. Star Wars Squadrons was the other title that just flat out refused to launch, and my suspicion lies with Easy Anti-Cheat not having an updated client for Steam Play yet. Hopefully there will be an update in the future that at least allows single-player gameplay, if not full multiplayer support. There were only a couple games that needed a little elbow grease to get up and running. Red Dead Redemption 2 requires logging into the Rockstar Social Club as a form of DRM. Starting the game for the first time, it's supposed to prompt you to log in, or Steam should be storing your credentials and log in for you. However, the Social Club was unable to communicate with the network when trying to launch Red Dead directly. Instead, I had to add the Rockstar Social Club as a non-Steam title, just like I would a third-party application, and log in through the launcher directly. Once I did that, Social Club stayed logged in, and Red Dead Redemption played without an issue, even averaging 70 frames per second at ultra settings, which is a feat unto its own right. You may run into similar issues with games that require launchers other than Steam. Far Cry 5 requires the use of Uplay from Ubisoft, however, that allowed me to log in without any issues. Fallout 4 ran like an absolute dream, locked at 60 frames per second at maximum settings. I don't even think the fan spun up on the 6900 XT during that one. A couple of the older titles really surprised me on this system, as they have compatibility issues just running inside modern versions of Windows, let alone sitting atop a Linux kernel. Star Wars Starfighter had no problem running, and running well, with the game still looking quite good despite being old enough to order a beer on its own. Typically, it will refuse to even load in Windows 10 and will have glitched graphics even if you do manage to get it in-game. Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2 was one of the first online multiplayer shooters that I played all the way back in 1997, and was also one of the first Windows games to start adopting hardware 3D acceleration. I know this sounds odd, but getting 3D acceleration working in this game is no easy feat inside of modern Windows, as it relies on Direct3D 5.0 compatibility. Instead, any versions of Windows since Windows XP will likely use software rendering instead of 3D acceleration. While DirectX cards don't know how to talk to this game, Proton and Wine have no issue at all, with full 3D acceleration working just like it did back in the 90s. Now I just need to figure out how to enable resolutions higher than 320 by 240, and we should be good to go. Jumping back into the modern era, Elden Ring shows no issues at all, running at 1080p max settings and holding a very solid 60 frames per second. The one problem I ran into was the lack of controller support in Linux. Normally, my Xbox One controller has no issues being used in games, but Elden Ring refused any input from it at all. Interestingly, Elden Ring also refused to let the Steam overlay or FPS counter load on top of the game, which all may be related to each other. While there are a ton of games I'm not going to go over individually in this list, I can leave you with this. Yes, Virginia, Crysis and Cyberpunk both run, and run quite well at that. So, gaming is no issue at all for an operating system developed by a gaming company, and 10 years into the development of SteamOS, that really shouldn't surprise you. Valve has been pushing for this level of performance and compatibility for the last decade, and I'm thrilled they've gotten as far as they have. But what about the rest of this operating system? As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, SteamOS uses Arch Linux and runs on the Plasma KDE desktop environment. The things that you need in a modern operating system are all present and accounted for. Chromium web browser is installed by default, but there's no reason you can't install another browser of your choosing. Window navigation is fast and intuitive, with great looking animations to let you know exactly what's going on when you click a button. Minimize throws your windows down onto the taskbar. Double-clicking a desktop icon displays a little bouncing icon next to your cursor to let you know the application is loading. Everything in the interface follows the conventions that we've come to expect from using a keyboard and mouse on a desktop PC. In the Applications menu, all the usual Linux fare is here, with VLC Media Player for video and audio playback, a simple text editor, photo viewer, and webcam capture app all present. The most interesting thing to me about running SteamOS on this machine is I haven't once opened the terminal window. Not once have I had to type something in, run a CLI application or script, compile a GitHub repo, or alter a setting that can only be accessed in text form because the menu GUI form doesn't exist. SteamOS is Linux, but so far this distro of Linux has just worked. While my experience has been nearly flawless, both on the Steam Deck and on the desktop, that's not to say that I think SteamOS is perfect. At least not yet. There is still plenty that can be done to improve the user experience and make this an even more intuitive and usable operating system. While Proton has been nearly perfect for launching Windows applications and games, launching those apps could do with some improvements. I would love to see Proton implemented as a service inside of SteamOS rather than a component of Steam itself. At the moment, the only way to launch a Windows executable is from Steam, rather than double-clicking on an icon or application that's on the desktop. I think making this process more transparent would be an incredible next step in helping with migration from Windows. Not everyone knows how or wants to add programs one at a time inside of the non-Steam app setup. Being able to just browse to an executable and run it would be a huge burden off of the end user. Along those same lines is the local file storage for Proton-based applications. Each application launched by Proton has its local file stored in its own unique folder. While this helps keep everything sandboxed and prevent issues with other applications, it also makes accessing things like game saves or configuration files a bit more of a chore. Red Dead Redemption 2, for example, required me to launch the Rockstar Launcher as a separate application just to log in for the first time. I had to browse through 10 subdirectories, all named with what seemed like random numbers, just to find the Social Club app I wanted. And even though I have it logged in now for Red Dead, I'd still need to go through the same process if I were to install Grand Theft Auto 5, which would also require its own install of the Social Club app and would need to be logged in much the same way. While SteamOS isn't perfect yet, it is good enough that I can recommend it to those adventurous enough to venture forth. While I didn't benchmark all 32 games side by side against their Windows counterparts, I think focusing solely on performance is kind of missing the mark. I'm sure both operating systems are going to have games that run faster and games that run slower, but I don't think many people are actually going to choose an operating system based solely on those criteria. Rather, I think frustrations with Windows, or the desire to try something new, will likely be the factors pushing people over the edge. In my opinion, SteamOS is one of the most complete Linux desktops I've ever used, as many of the features I rely on in Windows seem to be here and work in relatively the same way. What's even more incredible is we're still in the early development stages of SteamOS 3.0, and 30 out of the 32 games that I tested for this video work as well as they did on Windows. The future of SteamOS is certainly bright as well. This last week, I was able to get it up and running on my Aya Neo Next, with nearly every single feature working as intended. There are still some issues to work out, like remapping the Aya menu buttons to bring up the Steam menu overlays, but so far, this has erased nearly every single interface complaint that I had when I reviewed that console. Heck, even the RGB works with a custom controller inside of Linux, and that installed with one command line, so I guess I did access the terminal. Once. But it was for RGB. The year of the Linux desktop may finally be here, but is anyone going to be brave enough to actually jump on? I don't think I'm quite ready to dump Windows on my main two rigs, but that's mostly due to Adobe Premiere and some proprietary hardware that I have for streaming. But I don't think heavy metal is going to return to Windows, at least in its lifetime. One question I have for you all is, are you wanting to install SteamOS on your gaming rig, and what timeline do you think you'll do that on? Is there something you'd like to see me try with SteamOS? Let me know down in the comments below. On your way down there, make sure to drop this video a like and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. If you're interested in any of the parts from today's build, I will have affiliate links down in the video description. Go give those a look as well. You can also head on over to craftcomputing.store and grab yourself a pint glass to start drinking like a pro. Follow me on Twitter at Craft Computing to keep up with daily shenanigans like this. And if you like the content you see on this channel and want to help support me in what I do, consider joining the Patreon. Link is also down, well, in the usual spot. That's going to do it for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys. Beer for today is from Equilibrium Brewing out of Middleton, New York. It is the Hopwave 5 Double IPA, clocking in at 8.5%. As I mentioned a couple Hazy IPA reviews ago, there's been kind of this corner turned with a lot of breweries where they're not trying to make these super acidic bombs anymore. They're kind of trying to return to the roots and be a little bit more juicy. This is a really interesting one because it still has that juice bomb. It's still orange juice and guava and a little passion fruit maybe. But there's this clingy, oily, sour bitterness that just kind of sticks around well after you've taken a drink. I've been talking this whole time for this review, and I can still taste it, which is actually a profile of hops that I usually get on super dank Northwest style IPAs. It's really interesting to get that kind of balance with the juicy hazy with a really familiar flavor from a Northwest IPA. Whatever direction hazies are trying to go in, I definitely agree with them. And this one is worth a look.